Hi, I'm Donna Kallner. In this video, you'll see some sample project ideas for cross-knit looping that build on the use of flat panels. The most ambitious project here is a patchwork purse. Another project integrates cross-knit looping with a knitting project and uses both a flat panel and buttons made from the round base you learned in Lesson 2. But let's begin by adding a flap to a small pouch stitched from a needle chain base. This project also integrates shaping with decreases as you learned in Lesson 2. To begin a flap in a contrasting color, bury the tail of a new yarn on the inside of the pouch. Make a couple of cross-knit stitches with that new thread. Then go back and bury the tail of the old yarn on the inside of the pouch, making a U-turn and then burying the tail again in the opposite direction. The edge of this piece is fairly elastic. A U-turn helps keep a tail from popping out when the fabric is stretched. With the new thread, work cross-knit looping across the back of the pouch to start a flap. Rotate the piece and stitch back across the live edge to build on that flap. At the end of each row, use a simple looping stitch to build a selvedge. After several rows of working back and forth, the flap should be about long enough to reach over the mouth of the pouch to the front, and you're ready to think about shaping it with decreases. It probably won't take many skipped stitches on a pouch this size to get the shape you want, especially if you plan to include a button and buttonhole closure like on this sample. Buttons are great for practicing the round base that you learned in Lesson 2. To know exactly how big a buttonhole should be, I generally make the button before the buttonhole. For a button, begin a base from a slipknot ring and increase until the diameter is about the size you want for the button. Work without increases for a row or two, depending on how deep or fat you want the button. Then start decreasing to close the back of the button. Stuff the form with some fleece or waste yarn. To flatten the button, I like to make a few stitches through the center of the piece before stitching the button to the project. Now that you know how large the button is, you can make a buttonhole in the flap. Stitch across the flap to where the opening should begin. From there, you can work a needle chain the width of the button off of the edge of the flap. I worked a double needle chain on this piece. It's a minor variation, but I like the look of the edge, and it's a little bit different in its elasticity. When the buttonhole chain is the size you need, connect it to the live edge of the flap and continue stitching. When you come back across on the next row, the buttonhole chain acts as the live edge that you stitch into. Work additional decreases to get the shaping you want if necessary, and finish a flap by burying the tail with a U-turn. The cross-knit edging you learned in Lesson 2 is a great finish for flaps and a nice way to get a color contrast in a piece. In this next sample, the panel technique is used again to create a firm, stable edge in which buttonholes can be worked. But this flap of cross-knit looping is attached to knitting of the 2-needle sort. Now, I don't care for loose ends in a long scarf, so I adapted a simple knit lace pattern to make the lines of the lace point up towards my face instead of circling around my neck. After knitting the lace section, I changed yarn and knit stockinette stitch with a bit of garter stitch for variety, or actually because I lost track of where I was, and repeated it. Then I crocheted the edges together to form a double layer rectangle. It's just large enough to fill the gap at the neck of my coat and stand up around my neck and chin. The lace pattern stands out against the darker background, which adds both warmth and structure. I worked a band of cross-knit looping along one edge of the scarf, using the double needle chain again for the buttonholes, and made 2 buttons from cross-knit looping. It took me 3 tries to get the buttons positioned so the scarf would stand just the way I wanted it. Theoretically, I can button it different ways, but this is how I always seem to wear it. A project like this isn't really done until it's been blocked. I'll talk more about that in the Patchwork purse project now. The Patchwork purse is built on cross-knit panels. It's a great project to chip away at whenever you have a little time to make a small panel or add on to a larger one. In my example, I made one panel for a bag I wanted to be just large enough to hold a wallet and the case for my clip-on sunglasses. The front of the bag began with the brown panel. I worked into the selvage to add the gold section, then across the combined width for the gray section, then across the combined height for the brown section, then along the combined width for the gray section at the top. I added more brown across the width of the piece at the bottom to match the size of the back panel, and then I sewed a button made of cross-knit looping to the front. Before assembling a bag from these panel components, I blocked the panels. To block a wool piece, just give it a dip in a basin of cool water, roll it in a towel to press out most of the water, and then spread it out to dry. Now, the Patchwork front panel has many edges where varying elasticities meet, so that I pinned to a washcloth so it would encourage it to hold its shape while it dried. Now, you could stitch the front panel to the back panel like the sachet in Lesson 2, but I wanted some depth to this bag. I also could have worked a separate panel and connected one edge to the front panel and one edge to the back panel, but what I chose to do is work into the selvage on one side of the back panel and then across the bottom and up the selvage along the other side, and then worked back and forth. At the corners, you may or may not need to make some increases in the side panels. Try to envision a shape, then do what your eyes and your instincts tell you to go about making that shape happen. It's kind of easy to get caught up in the joyful repetition of stitches and forget to look at what you're stitching. So remind yourself frequently to stop, look, and listen. Not so much listen to the inner critic that points out imperfections, but to the inner voice that says, something about this is giving me a reason to question my choices here. What do I like, and how can I build on that? What do I not like, and how can I minimize that? What is there for me to learn here? When the side panel is the depth you want, stitch it to the front panel. When the body of the bag is assembled, use some cross knit looping on the edge where the main panels meet. They add to the design, they reinforce the edges, and frankly, they cover up joints that may not be as perfect as you like. Mine aren't either. Remember, the first rule of design is, if you can't fix it, feature it. On this sample, I also added a flap with a buttonhole and finished the flap in the rim of the bag with cross-knit looping on the edge. For a handle, I picked up just under the edging on one side and worked a narrow panel the length I wanted. Then I finished both edges of that panel for the handle with cross-knit looping on the edge. We've touched briefly on design considerations in these practice projects. The final video of this lesson will show another project with a focus on design. I'll see you there.